Good evening. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Chris Scalia. I'm a senior fellow here, and it's my pleasure to introduce the first installment of the second year of the American Dream Lecture Series. Part of the American Dream Initiative and in the tradition of AEI's old and esteemed Bradley Lecture Series, the American Dream Lecture Series seeks to bring prominent public intellectuals to AEI to discuss some of the social, cultural, and political issues confronting the United States as we approach the 250th anniversary of our founding. If you take a look at your table, there are some flyers there that have a couple of the upcoming events we have planned, including about a month from now, Columbia University professor and New York Times newsletter writer John McWhorter will come to speak about the left and language, and that will be followed by a conversation with AEI's own Joshua Katz. And then another event we don't actually have listed on that flyer because we've just scheduled it is in February. Commentary Magazine editor John Podhoretz will be here to speak about the state of American culture, and that's on February 13th. You see a couple of other items tentatively scheduled there as well. But today we turn to foreign policy. As some of you may have heard, there's a presidential election in November, and whoever succeeds Joe Biden in the White House will face myriad challenges abroad. Some snapshots. Although Ukraine has recently advanced into Russian territory, there is little sign of Vladimir Putin relenting in his invasion. In the Middle East, as Israel seeks to destroy Hamas and free the hostages in Gaza, it faces rocket attacks from Hezbollah, and Iran continues its quest to become the region's dominant power. Meanwhile, voices on the right urge American detachment from Ukraine, and voices on the left call out against our support for Israel. That's to say nothing of the mounting threat posed by China, which continues to increase military and political pressure against Taiwan. As tonight's guest has recently written, quote, "We are looking at an era of geopolitical competition driving a wave of wars." What steps should President Harris or President Trump take to address the many challenges we face abroad? What steps can we expect them to take? To answer these and other questions, we are fortunate to have one of America's most perceptive thinkers on foreign policy matters. Walter Russell Mead is the Ravenel B. Curry III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute, the Alexander Hamilton Professor of Strategy and Statecraft with the Hamilton Center for Classics and Civic Education at the University of Florida, and the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. From 1997 to 2010, he was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, serving as the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy from 2003 until his departure. His most recent book, The Ark of a Covenant, The United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People, examines the origins of American support for Israel and the relationship's impact on past, present, and future U.S. policy. He's contributed to a wide variety of leading American publications, including, I think most impressively, GQ. He frequently appears on national and international radio and television programs, and he's the proud uncle of an Olympic gold medal winner. Mr. Mead will speak for about 25 minutes, after which he'll participate in a discussion with AEI's Kori. Buckle up for another introduction. Dr. Schake is a senior fellow and the director of foreign and defense policies here at AEI. She previously served as the deputy director general of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. During her distinguished career in government, she worked at the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She also taught at Stanford, West Point, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the National Defense University, and the University of Maryland. She's been published widely in policy journals and the popular press, and is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and War on the Rocks. She's the author of 5 books, and her next book, her 6th one, will be out next year. It's about civil and military relations. Walter and Kori will converse for about 20 minutes, and then we'll turn to audience questions. Afterwards, I hope you'll join us for light refreshments and deep conversations right outside these doors. But first, please join me in welcoming Walter Russell Mead.
Thank you, Chris. Well, thanks for that introduction, Chris, and for the warm welcome. Chris and I just passed a wonderful time before the program talking about his next book, which comes out in the spring, maybe, on the 13 novels that conservatives probably haven't read but should. I don't know, maybe I fail as a conservative because I think I'd read just about all of them. But you really should read these if you haven't. So be on the lookout for a great book. And of course, to be in conversation with Kori, the shocking Dr. Shockey, is always a lot of fun. And I think we're going to have an interesting time tonight. I've been asked to talk about what some of the challenges the next presidential administration might face in American foreign policy, and a bit about what the different candidates might or might not do. That's going to be the second part of that is the hardest, because I remember what a reporter once asked Harold Macmillan when he became prime minister in the UK, what will be driving your foreign policy, prime minister? And he said, events, dear boy, events. And whether we have a President Trump or a President Harris after this election, they're going to both have a lot of events. And it's likely that the world that they inhabit is going to turn out to be very, very different from the world that either one of them expected to inhabit. And they're going to face different challenges, different constraints, different opportunities. And I think it's quite likely that either one of them will be surprised at how their administration's foreign policy turns out. But where I want to start with is maybe to give us some of the context that will be driving some of the events that will drive the next administration. And here I think we can see a large, and from, I think, my point of view, and perhaps from others, disturbing tendency, which is that what we're watching in the world today is the progressive and escalating decline of the Pax Americana, the system of economic and political arrangements and practices that flowed from the American victories in the 2 greatest conflicts of the 20th century, World War II and the Cold War. Why is this Pax Americana? And you notice I don't use rules-based order here because I think it was never based on rules. It was actually based on American power, and then the way that Americans tried to ground their power, or rather manifest their power in systems rather than in simple acts or simple policies, and to build a web, they hoped, of systems that in a best case scenario might even survive the decline of American power. That was at the back of people's minds. And I'm not sure that, and I think we can actually say now that we failed in this, that to some degree what is shaping our situation today is that the American grand strategy following the Cold War failed. That strategy was to use the unipolar moment that came into existence with the collapse of the Soviet Union and before the rise of China, when the United States had no peer or near peer in the world, where the United States was really the only power that could kind of put an issue on the international agenda, much less resolve the issue. And it was more or less What determined what we did in the world was what we wanted to do or did not want to do, and the wishes of others had little impact. So during the wars in the Balkans, when Russia didn't like what we were doing, they sent a few troops to an airport, and it didn't affect things. They expressed their unhappiness, but they did not affect the course of events. So we hope during that window to lay down institutions, practices that would command enough assent by other powers that even should other countries reach a point of being able to challenge the American order, they wouldn't want to. They would voluntarily abstain, and even as Germany and Japan after World War II end up being some of the stronger pillars of this Pax Americana, again, voluntarily and out of the perception of their own interests and values. So Russia, China, India would do the same as they emerged in the post-Cold War era. It didn't work. The unipolar moment is over, and we do not have the kind of agreed-on consensus of what should replace it or how to supplant it. Instead, we're facing quite hostile and focused geopolitical competition from a group of quite powerful countries with their own agendas and visions. So we can agree, I think. Perhaps somebody here will want to challenge me in the Q&A, and I'm open to challenge. And unfortunately, though, you aren't my student, so I can't fail you for challenging me. But I think we will largely agree that we're not where anybody wanted to be in 1990. That the world of 2024 is not what Americans hope to be building, hope to inhabit. But here we are. And the disputes I think that future historians are going to have is, why did we fail? What went wrong? Did Clinton have the Clinton administration come to questions like the WTO and NAFTA with a naive view of trade and rules? Did the Bush administration make fatal misjudgments in the response to 9/11, maybe especially the war of Iraq? Was the Obama administration maybe too weak in Syria, maybe too, sort of inconstant? Was President Trump too brusque and brash? Was President Biden too what can I say? Too unstrategic in his approach to international affairs? You can make a case for all of those, but was there a great mistake that set everything on the wrong path? Was there something inherently flawed in the original design that we set off kind of after an unachievable goal, or what? I mean, we don't know, and future historians, I think, will debate, perhaps in the ashes of the conflicts that may be coming, will debate how we got here. And I'm not going to try to resolve that tonight, but it is true that both the Harris and the Trump worlds come to American politics with different ideas of what went wrong and how to fix it, or what to do now, because I'm not sure that the Trump people are interested in fixing it in a sense of restoring the Pax Americana in some ways. I would say at the moment, Team Harris is more aligned with the goal of somehow repairing and restoring the Pax Americana, but is unlikely to want to make the kinds of investments that would be required to do it. Team Trump is not at all committed, is not even sure that the Pax Americana was a good idea in the first place, is certainly not prepared to make the investments required to restore it, but also may gravely underestimate the risks and costs that would come of letting what remains of that Pax fall away. So again, I think either candidate getting into the White House is going to find themselves dealing with a world that is not necessarily well aligned with the assumptions that they're bringing to the White House. That's actually not so surprising. That's happened to a great many of our presidents. Harry Truman did not think on the day he assumed office that his administration would be defined by a Cold War. Woodrow Wilson famously said it would be the greatest irony in history if my administration would be most noted for its conduct of international affairs. Bill Clinton ran against George H.W. Bush, basically on the argument that we had too much foreign policy under George H.W. Bush, and what we needed was to, for America to pay attention domestically. George W. Bush ran for office on the idea of America, has gotten too big for its britches. We're talking too loudly. We need to be a kinder, gentler people, humbler nation, and took it in a very different direction. So presidents, and I certainly think Barack Obama never in his worst nightmares imagined that the Middle East would be in a worse place after 8 years of an Obama administration than it was at the end of the George W. Bush administration. That American prestige would be drastically lower in the Middle East, American values farther from being realized, American allies more divided. This is just not something that people would have called you a racist if you had predicted in 2009 that 8 years later things would have dramatically deteriorated, but they did. Okay, so we've got two candidates coming into office, both of them with a set of assumptions that are unlikely to give them a reliable guide to the world that they're in. Let's talk a little bit more granularly about what some of these challenges are, and I'll try to give quick thoughts about what either of the two might do. Obviously, the central challenge facing the United States from a geopolitical point of view is the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific and China's apparent interest in challenging and perhaps replacing the Pax Americana with a Pax Sinica? Sinica? I don't know. Sinica probably is the, possibly in a few years we'll all know that phrase by heart. The most immediate flashpoint of potential confrontation is the island of Taiwan. People who think many Americans don't have an idea of why Taiwan is important. I would say a majority of those who know that Taiwan is important have the wrong reason in mind. They think, it's the semiconductors. Now, the semiconductors in Taiwan, that's where the world's best semiconductors are produced in the greatest volumes. Those are important, and it would be a problem if something happened to Taiwan from that sense. But far more important than that in terms of world history, this would be that if Taiwan were forcibly reunified with China, neither Japan nor South Korea could afford to remain aligned with the United States. And they would both have to make their peace with Beijing more or less on Beijing's terms. And if you talk to senior officials in both countries, they understand this. If you talk to the people on the street, they don't understand it much better than the average American does. So this is, for 200 plus years, the core of American foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific has been to prevent any single power from dominating the region out of a fear that it would, A, limit our ability to access economic opportunities that we think would be necessary for our own future economic development, and B, because any power accumulating all of those resources would have ambitions and power that would endanger us here, and endanger the U.S. itself, a lesson that was kind of powerfully struck home in 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. So the U.S. tried to stop the British from becoming the dominant power. We tried to stop the Japanese from becoming the dominant power. We tried to stop the Soviets from becoming the dominant power. And now we're sort of coming to grips with the situation with China. Failure in this would be world historical in consequences. It would mean that countries like India and Australia would probably also have to seek some kind of modus vivendi with a hegemonic China. It's a big deal. I would say that neither American public opinion, nor the American military, nor the foreign policy people around either candidate is fully prepared to deal with the possibilities here. And I would also say that China understands the stakes. China understands what the seizure of Taiwan would mean. And I would say that if China even blockaded Taiwan and the U.S. decided to resist with a counter blockade or something of that kind, we would see a massive, the biggest economic disaster since the Great Depression. If the seas around Taiwan become essentially a no-go zone for commercial traffic, it's a lot worse than what we see right now with the Houthis in the Red Sea. It's like Japan can't import or export freely. South Korea can't import or export freely. China won't be able to import or export freely. The goods that go in and out of those nations would be taken out of the world economy. What this would do in terms of commodity prices, stock prices, unemployment, shortages of key goods is again, something the world hasn't really looked at since the years of World War II. So this is not a remote contingency. This is a clear and present danger that the next administration might well have to face. I see very few signs that either candidate has wrapped their heads around these realities. Right? Let's travel next to Moscow and the next most, the sort of next most serious challenge to this eroding American world order. And what we see, I'm afraid I would characterize the Biden administration's Ukrainian program policy is that they built a tremendous coalition that's spending a lot of money and failing to stop Putin in Ukraine. That's what they've done. And their essential hope, as far as I can make it out, is that Ukraine will ultimately get tired of fighting a war that it can't win. And one of the reasons it won't be able to win is because the West won't give it enough weapons or money to make victory possible. And so the Ukrainians, of their own free will enter into a negotiation with Russia that will effectively partition Ukraine. I think the folks in the White House probably dreamed that Putin would allow Ukrainian membership in NATO as part of this settlement. I don't think they understand Mr. Putin very well if that's what they're thinking. So we have a policy that aims to produce failure at great cost. And that success for the policy is like non-obvious failure at great cost. But the effect of that on NATO, on transatlantic relations would be immense. And also in terms of corroding the will of the American people to support a foreign policy that goes beyond our own hemisphere would be significant. The cynicism behind this policy does not build constituents or support for an internationalist foreign policy of any kind. And then we can go to the Middle East, where Iran, which of the three big revisionist powers is the weakest, the poorest, the most fragile domestically, and has had, I think fundamentally because of American weakness and unwillingness to face reality in the eye, has had more success than either China or Russia in altering its international environment. The runt of the litter is running the table. So if you think about what's been happening over the last few years, Iran or its allies have pretty much taken over Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. The Houthis have closed the Red Sea. This is something the United States has not allowed since World War II. It's an extraordinary retreat from what has been for more than 200 years a key goal of the United States, free travel through international waters. We seem to be sort of deciding that that's not such an interesting problem anymore anyway. Okay. And we see Iran has been making progress conventionally in terms of continuing to build up its clients, create strategic level threats to our allies in the Middle East without much American response. And it is also clearly advancing closer and closer to it is steadily reducing the time interval before it would acquire nuclear weapons. My guess is that the next president will likely face a nuclear Iran or face the alternative of war with Iran or accepting a nuclear Iran. Again, I'm not sure. I don't think either candidate really knows what they would do under those circumstances, but I think that is something they are very likely to face. So, not a very attractive proposition, especially when the core supporters of both candidates are inward-looking. I haven't even talked about trade yet, and I won't. Maybe in the Q&A we can get to it. But the gap, and this, I think, this is one of the things about decline, one of the things about the end of the Pax Americana, if it comes. And by the way, I don't think it has to come, but if it comes, when you are declining, when your system is breaking up, all of your choices are simultaneously becoming worse. All right? You know that your foreign policy is failing when at every step you are faced with uglier and uglier choices and more bitter trade-offs. This is where we've been headed, at least since 2014, when the Obama administration outmatched Chamberlain, in my view, in terms of appeasement with Russia in Crimea and the Donbass. But even earlier, you could say when George W. Bush failed to respond in any serious way to Russia's invasion of Georgia. We have been on a track in which progressively our choices are getting worse, the options are deteriorating on every side, and our national unity about our foreign policy is also splintering, because the worse and uglier the choices get, actually the harder it is to build consensus around any kind of policy. So what I'm predicting is an interesting life for our next president. And we can talk some more about some of these issues in Q&A. I will say, however, in spite of all of this, I actually do remain an optimist about the future of the United States. And I do believe that we are the chief causes of many of our problems, and that we have it in us to turn history into a much more positive direction. Well, thank you very much.
So thank you for gracing AEI, Walter. This is such a rich set of comments to frame. I guess my first question is, was there a different grand strategy the U.S. could have promulgated and carried out in the time of American dominance, so the post-Cold War period, that would have put us in a different and better place than the strategy we did prosecute?
I think a bit more modesty would have helped. In some ways, what the U.S. sort of instinctively decided to do in 1989, 1990 was kind of to try to do on a global scale what West Germany was trying to do on the local scale. That they were going to turn East Germany into West Germany at the expenditure, it turned out, of 1.6 trillion euros, We've seen from the recent local elections that did not work out that well. And I think we fundamentally underestimated the importance of culture. So we underestimated the difficulties of sort of trying to make the world kind of like one big European Union or whatever. That I remember listening, I was actually with Nina Khrushcheva, who's the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev and is a wonderful, very funny person and got a lot of great ideas. But we were with a group of economists, this would be early in the 90s. And they were talking about how, oh my gosh, these economic reforms, as Russia introduces them, it's going to be capitalist. And I, at that point, spent just enough time in Russia to know that's not what's going to be happening. And the economists would not listen to any arguments. It's like, hey, the laws of economics are really clear. They're right here on this blackboard. They work the same in Moscow as they do in New York, et cetera, et cetera. And there obviously is a sense in which that's true. But once you throw in politics and culture, different things, deviations begin. And so Nina, at the end of this conference, said, well, you're all very intelligent. You really understand everything very well. But I have to say, at the end of the day, there is something Russian about Russia. And I think if we had thought more that there's something Russian about Russia, something Chinese about China, something Indian about India, and so on, we might have developed a less ambitious but more durable approach to somehow managing to keep the peace among these very divergent and differently motivated countries and civilizations.
So one of my favorite themes in your work is the Americanness of America. And I love the kind of arc of how it comes through your books, right? The Anglo-American origins of religious tolerance, go-go capitalism, and representative government in God and gold. And then the specific American schools of foreign policy in special providence. And the way that you focus then on how those shape the particular American-Israeli relationship. How are you feeling about the American-Israeli relationship, both in light of the October 7th attacks and the Gaza war, and in light of campus protests in the US?
Yeah. It is a really interesting set of questions. One of the things that I found as I was looking, spending far too many years learning about and then trying to write about the history of U.S.-Israel relations, which is very much connected with the history of U.S. ideas about Judaism and the Jewish people and the role of American Jews in American politics and culture. Was that, first of all, that anti-Semitism rises and falls over American history. There's not this sort of pattern of, oh, in the early primitive days, we were very anti-Semitic, but over the centuries, as tolerance gradually grew, we became less anti-Semitic. There's been, sort of philo-Semitism, anti-Semitism, and not really thinking or caring very much about Jews one way or the other, have all marked all periods of American history. But in general, when the American system comes under stress and people begin to doubt that things like the American melting pot, the American dream are real and work, then you start to see anti-Semitism really emerging. So the Depression was an era of enormous anti-Semitism. There you have Henry Ford writing his anti-Semitic essays in the Dearborn Independent. We can perhaps think of other wealthy people in America today tweeting, and anti-Semitic tweets have started to appear. And yet after World War II, when in the 1950s and most of the 60s, it was seen that the American dream seemed to be working. And people, the children of the Okies, driven out to California by the Depression, were like, they were the Beach Boys. They were surfing in Southern California. Everything was good. Anti-Semitism, as well as many other forms of ethnic prejudice and hatred, diminished dramatically. We are now in a period in which doubts about does the American dream work, is America real? Some people would say this idea that we could be a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, that's really just the mask that white supremacy uses to, enforce a certain hierarchy. Or others would say it's a mask for great replacement theories that real America is being destroyed by fake America. Right? As these ideas come out, we see the old demons are coming out again. The sun goes down and strange things come out of the shadows, I think.
So American policy toward China is premised on the basis of stampeding success by China, right? Like, we're worried about China's rise. But at least economically, and probably in foreign policy, China's made a set of choices that have activated the antibodies against their continued success. I mean, Chinese GDP is $18,000. That's the equivalent of Mexico or Mozambique. And they don't seem politically in the leadership capable of making the choices to propel themselves out of the middle income trap. Are you more worried about a successful China or about a stagnating China that's no longer successful?
Well, you can pick your poison. The reality is that if China has kind of hit a wall, and the thing about China is the world has never seen anything like this, in the sense so rapid economic development over such a large space, continued through so much time. It's a phenomenon that neither the Chinese nor we really can understand very well, because it is unprecedented. And the economic and social strains that come with this extraordinary development are new, and also the resources that the society can bring to bear to address the challenges are new. So in my view, it's a fool's game to try to predict winner or loser. Now, I do sometimes look at Xi Jinping and think I see somebody who combines the sort of international political talents of Wilhelm II with the economic management talents of Herbert Hoover. But, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, I don't know. But yes, China has reached a point of technological and economic development that means that what happens inside China is no longer of concern only to China. And so, yes, we might have to face an aggressive expansion in China. We might have to face an embittered decline in China. If everything worked out, we might face a China that realized that it can succeed better in a world in which it is not creating difficulties in the path of its own peaceful integration. That would remain my hope, but right now it's not what we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. And Iran policy seems to me a place where at least the last 3 and probably the last 4 administrations had a declaratory policy that they had no intention of actually carrying out. That is, the declaratory policy was we will prevent by military action, if necessary, Iran becoming a nuclear possessor state. And yet, across those last 4 administrations, that progress has been unrelenting, and we're now in the weeks away from the ability. What should we be doing to Iran or about Iran to either change policy or bring American willingness to carry out the policy back into alignment?
Well, hard question, and there's not necessarily a lot of time, as you note. I think what we need for our national leadership is to really think through which is worse, dealing with the consequences of trying to deal with Iran or dealing with the consequences of not dealing with Iran. My own sense of this is that Iran's hostility to the United States and our key regional allies is part of the warp and woof of this regime, its ideology, its legitimacy, both at home and in the Middle East. And that the dream that, everybody has, every American president since Putin took power has tried to flip Putin and resets and look into soul gazes and all of these things, and nothing. Every American president really since Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter tried to negotiate with the moderates in Iran. Ronald Reagan sent the Bible and the cake with Ollie North. At some point, you really need to take no for an answer. They don't want to be friends. They benefit in a number of ways from a hostile relationship, especially a hostile relationship with a weakening and retreating United States. So, will they become less hostile as they gain more power? It seems to me the answer is no. Do we still need to prevent a hostile power from controlling access to the oil in the Middle East? The answer, I believe, is yes. And so for me, there does not, we seem to be on a collision course in which if we don't take adequate steps to defend a vital interest, we'll have to live with the very, very serious consequence of a bunch of people who hate us in Tehran being able to hold the world economy to ransom more or less at will. Don't think that's a great idea. I also don't think their hostility toward Israel will diminish. Their desire to destroy that state, to replace the current government in Saudi Arabia, which for all of the flaws that people can talk about, has done almost everything we've ever asked the government of Saudi Arabia to do in terms of distancing itself from terrorism, changing and reducing the power of religious police in daily life, shifting toward a more economic development track, moving toward a better relationship with Israel. They've really done a lot more of what we have wanted than any other Saudi government I can imagine. So where I think we should be trying to do, what I would be advising a president to do, would be to say, look, we've got in the Middle East, unlike other parts of the world, we actually have some allies who are willing and able to do a lot of the work themselves. We should be talking to the Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis and some others in the region and say, okay, what do you need to do to protect yourself from this threat? What should we be giving you? And I think we should be encouraging our regional allies to take the lead in what is an existential issue for their own future, and letting it be known publicly and privately, we will back you to the hilt. That, I think, is what we should be doing.
It's a smart strategy. So my favorite thing about your scholarship is what you do almost uniquely among foreign policy experts is anchor how you write about foreign policy in American domestic political culture. And you've been doing that even a lot more in your podcast, focusing on domestic wellsprings of strength. So I have a couple of questions on that. And the first is, maybe follows on to what you were saying about Saudi Arabia. which is how should we hit the balance between the values that govern our domestic political contract and the countries whose help and cooperation we need in the world that have different, you suggested we've leaned too far forward in trying to make everybody in our image. And I really like the work of Dalibor Rohac here at AEI, who suggests that we in the West bear some culpability for the democratic backsliding in places like Hungary and Poland because we conflated the advance of democracy with liberal social values that are in many ways inconsistent with the religious and cultural legacies in those countries. How would you advise us to hit that balance?
Right. That's, again, really good questions. I think some of this is that, I look back in history, and Americans have always wanted to transform the world. That's, there's never been a time when there weren't a lot of Americans who thought that it was our duty. And it comes out of this sense of, it doesn't come out of some iron drive for conquest. It's, wow, God has blessed this country far beyond its deserts. We have a freedom, we have an abundance. It would be, and this obviously wasn't just done because God loves us more than he loves other people. It's God has given us a mission. With these blessings comes responsibility. And we need to share the values. We need to tell those Chinese, stop binding the feet of women. We need to, there's a whole long list of things around the world that we need to be helping people to do. One of the things that I find interesting is that until the 20th century, by and large, that was the job of American civil society. And so you didn't have State Department bureaucrats going out there and saying, okay, fly right? But you had tens of thousands of American missionaries in the world, some mostly focused on religion, some mostly focused, frankly, on economic development and uplift, right? But the United States government insisted that as American citizens, those missionaries enjoyed consular protection. So it was not the government turning its back on this side of the American experiment.
Yeah.
And I would actually think we in the United States would benefit from a bit more separation of church and state here. That it is not necessary. And in fact, it's, one of the reasons we separate church and state is to protect religion from being corrupted by the state and the state from being corrupted by religion. And I think we can see in a lot of American democracy promotion or other promotions some of the results of the corruption. Because American foreign policy can never be 100% aligned with sort of the moral regeneration of mankind. It just, there's going to be a Saudi Arabia, or there's going to be some other country. In World War II, we sided with Stalin, the only guy on the planet who'd kill more people than Hitler, all right? Because we had to. And so when we have to, we will. But then it makes it very easy for other people to say double standard, hypocrisy. And if we're saying that our government is the kind of embodiment of the universal human spirit producing democracy and so on around the world, that's where we're there. But on the other side too, I noted recently that the United States, I can't remember if we're condemning Uganda or sanctioning Uganda. We're doing something to Uganda because it's passed what are frankly some pretty terrible laws on homosexuality, at least in my view, all right? Death penalty type laws, which seems, can I say it, excessive, all right? Even from the standpoint of traditional Christian morality, that seems going a bit far. So we're sanctioning them. But the message is not, oh my gosh, the United States of America is a great upholder of human rights. That's the way we would like to think it's being seen. But what it is Uganda understands this, and so does everyone else on the planet, that the only reason we're doing this to Uganda is because we have utter contempt for Uganda. That is to say, if it were selling us something that we needed, our mouths would be shut. If it was providing us with a base that we needed, our mouths would be shut. If its diplomatic influence on something that we cared about was real, we would keep our mouths shut. So that when you have the state trying to enforce a moral guideline, you inevitably and horribly end up undermining the very values that you're trying to uphold, and you present yourself to the world as a hypocrite. So civil society, there's a lot of business. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, render unto God that which is God's. American civil society is vibrant, dynamic, filled with many different points of view, thank God, many different religious and non-religious traditions and ideas, and the American people are a free people. Have at it. But I don't think we should try to turn the American government into the universal church.
That is a genuinely brilliant answer to how to navigate that difficult problem.
Well, thank you, Kori. It's always fun talking to you.
I have one last question before opening this up for all of you. And it too is a domestic question. The American Dream Project here at AEI is designed to help us think about how to strengthen the institutions and structures of American society. And one of my favorite passages in Special Providence, your brilliant book on American foreign policy, is when you are describing the Hamiltonian tradition, you talk about financial esprit, right? The ease with which we brush away bankruptcy, insolvency, create opportunity. Chapter 11, which is the wellspring of vitality in the American economy. What should we be doing to strengthen that sense of financial esprit that makes the American economy so vibrant?
Well, I'm going to say one thing that may be controversial here, but I think we need to restore the age of financial majority to 21. I think what we're doing now is we're having 18-year-olds sign student loan contracts that are basically undischargeable in bankruptcy, or largely undischargeable in bankruptcy, at a time when the people advising them about these contracts have a financial interest in the students signing up for this $40,000 tuition loan or whatever it may be. The professor I'm an English major and proud of it, but all the big English literature companies when I graduated weren't hiring that year, so I had to scramble a bit to make a living, all right? But you have people, the faculty who you look up to as your role models and guides aren't telling you that if you take out a $40,000 a year student loan to major in English literature, you're going to come out of college with $160,000 in debt and no realistic way of paying it off anytime soon and no way to get out of it by bankruptcy. So when you are, at least if we restored the age of majority to 20, and by the way, credit cards also, but if we restored the age of majority on finance to 21, I'm not saying take away the vote, by the way, then I think you would see parents would have to co-sign and be co-responsible, and parents often have thoughts on these matters. Parents often know what a debt is like and why they're bad things. They know what a $500 a month student loan payment can do to your budget. So some things like that. But the fact that for many Americans, their first encounter with the credit system is an abusive system that's rigged against them does a lot about people's attitudes about capitalism, about social trust. Okay, this is just one of the things, but this, I really do believe this is a place where we are letting our young people down and training them, teaching them profoundly negative attitudes about their society and about capitalism.
Fabulous. An unexpected answer and a really interesting one. Okay, my friends, now the time is yours. First here in front and then in the back. Please introduce yourself.
Atman Vakil, AEI, and my question's about how Pax Americana relates to one of America's greatest assets, the dominant and strong dollar. Is there some way the next president or next administration can leverage that strength into restoring Pax Americana?
Okay, well that is, talking about the relationship of the dollar's position and American power is one of the conversations that people have around the world. And in parts of the world, they think about, okay, how can we destroy it? Because if we can destroy the dominance of the dollar, we bring the whole thing down. And I think, there are people in Washington who've gotten intoxicated on the power of a reserve currency, A, because it means we can spend as much as we want without limit, and that's not a good idea, and B, because they think that sanctions can accomplish a lot more than in fact they can. Sanctions are often just a way of, when you actually don't want to do something about something, but you don't want to admit to yourself or other people that you don't want to do something, you sanction someone, and then you look in the mirror and you say, moral hero. But it doesn't actually get the job done 99% of the time. So, but the dollar dominance is actually not a reflection so much of a conscious American policy as simply the dynamism of American society. We make a lot of stuff. We've built really interesting and strong financial markets. You can do a lot of things with a dollar besides putting it in your mattress. And so people, without America putting a gun to their head or anything else, people want dollars when their own currencies are less than trustworthy. If you go to Argentina, you'll find that like anything expensive is priced in dollars, et cetera, et cetera. So do no harm would be my first step, but also don't expect that dollar dominance is a reflection of American power more than a cause of American power. And I don't think it's a tool that can be very easily used in the way some people would like to use it.
Matt Continetti.
Matt Continetti from AEI. Kori mentioned the Hamiltonians. I'd like to ask a question about the Jacksonians, my favorite. So how do you convince the Jacksonians to buy in to the Pax Americana at a time when it's ebbing? And I note that the Army continued to not meet its recruiting goals. And we rely on a very small percentage of our population, many of whom come from families of military service in combat arms. How do we reinvigorate that spirit to defend the Pax Americana?
Okay, well, I doubt there's much that we can do to this. These are people who think for themselves and have their own views. I would say this, that while those of us who do foreign policy for a living often think about, often think about hope as a great motivating factor, the beautiful structure that we could build with the Pax Americana and so on, and how nice that would be. What historically drives nations and populations is fear. And Jacksonians noticed in 1990 that there was a lot less to worry about in the world with the fall of the Soviet Union. America did not have a 40-year consensus to fight the Soviet Union because liberal internationalists persuaded people of the beauties and the grandeur of the rules-based international order. Did it because American Jacksonians really hated communism and were really scared by it. And I think you can make an argument that if it weren't for the passions that lit McCarthyism, there might not have been a NATO and there might not have been a Marshall Plan, voting for the Marshall Plan. And so fear is what drives a lot of ordinary Americans to care about foreign policy, enlist in the military, and do these other things. Now, I actually believe that there is a lot to fear in the world today. As I look at the declining strength of the Pax Americana, the ebbing away, I see a wave of wars rising around us. I believe that we're going to see more economic trouble. You know, you close down the Red Sea, it raises costs, makes commerce harder. We're going to have to, because of national security concerns about supply chains, we will have to move away from the full free trade agenda that we had. Regardless of what you think about protectionism or free trade in theory, we got to make sure that China can't stop us from getting the stuff that we actually need to function, et cetera. That's going to be expensive. It's going to make the economy, perform less well. It means we're likely to have more inflation at lower rates of unemployment and just make a lot of ugly trade-offs uglier. So, but more than that, we are seeing the rise of regimes with ambitions that will ultimately force us into war, could force us into war on the scale of World War II or greater. And so what needs to happen in this country is people need to learn the realities about the world that they're in. The reality of how fragile peace is in Asia. The reality that the developments in cyber war and so on are really bringing an end to the dream of arms control to some degree. You can have verifiable agreements about nuclear weapons because you can sort of look and see what the other side is doing. But you talk about cyber war. We don't really know what's happening in some computer in the basement of some Russian hacking factory. And they don't know what we're up to. And we can solemnly swear that we will not engage in certain types of operations, but only an idiot would actually believe it. So we are moving into an era of rapid technological change, zero strategic trust, accelerating arms races, and political and social instability in much of the world. Everything in history tells us this looks like a pre-war era, right? And I think if we can make the case rationally and sensibly, and maybe some people will make the case irrationally and unsensibly, I think the American people, I still in my heart believe the American people are a lot smarter than a lot of folks give them credit for, and can see it just as they saw it in the 40s. That's at least my hope. And if that doesn't work, I don't really have any other suggestions.
There's in the late 19th century, when Britain was losing its advantage over the United States and anticipated they might actually have to fight us because of our rambunctiousness towards British holdings in Canada. The first Sea Lord
You mean our desire to liberate the oppressed neighbors to the north?
Exactly. The first Sea Lord was asked what he would do absent adequate funding for defense, and he said, "Trust in God and a capable admiral." And we're almost at that point, my friends, in American thinking about these issues. 2 questions right here.
Thank you very much. I'm Jenny Park with USA Journal. The U.S., there is a significant differences in the foreign policy toward North Korea between the next Harris presidency and the next Trump presidency. The U.S. has had a dialogue with North Korea in the past, but nothing has changed. What is clearly is that North Korea has never given up its nuclear weapons and continues to threaten the Korean Peninsula and the international community. What foreign policy does the United States have that can ensure North Korea's denuclearization?
Good question. Let's take the second one before Walter answers, since we're almost out of time.
Thank you very much. My name is Yannick Tona. I'm the head of our political division here at the Embassy of Rwanda. And thank you very much for a very candid conversation. My question is, I would touch a little bit on Africa. Where do you see Africa into the conversation and the challenge you mentioned? And what will you advise to African government, seeing this reality, and how do we approach this and how we deal with this? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, quickly, I would say on North Korea, neither the United States nor anybody else really has a North Korea policy and hasn't really had one for a very long time. We haven't, we continue to say that we do not accept North Korea's nuclear program and that we look to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And North Korea continues to develop its nuclear weapons in quantity, quality, and range of deliverability. I would say that North Korea has clearly been contained for, in that it hasn't ever used these weapons. So in that sense, the policy, the fallback policy of we'll wipe you out if we use them seems to have given the North Koreans the same stability that other nuclear powers have achieved, balance of terror. I think one thing that I certainly worry about is suppose some of these situations developed around Taiwan, where U.S. attention and so on is entirely focused on Taiwan and perhaps Japan. What does North Korea do if it believes that the United States is completely distracted or can't respond to what's going on in North Korea? So, but again, if I were in South Korea right now, I would worry more about the consequences of a Chinese attack on Taiwan or blockade of Taiwan, because this, where will South Korea get its food and fuel if the seas around, if the South China Seas are closed to maritime traffic? How will it export things? I think South Korea would face an existential crisis, even if it was not participating in these hostilities. And the kinds of decisions that would be made in the United States and Japan and Taiwan over that conflict would have an immense consequence for South Korea. So I would say it's very important for South Korea to realize, difficult as it can be, that the North Korean threat is part of a regional environment. And South Korea needs to think regionally and not merely about the peninsula. That would be my advice, and that helping to strengthen the regional alliance so that China will be deterred from attacking or blockading Taiwan, thus creating a crisis where North Korea could seize an opportunity. If I were trying to advise the Korean government, that's the advice I would give them, to focus on that. On Africa, Africa is in a difficult situation because while it has benefited less than some other parts of the world from the Pax Americana, it is likely to be damaged more by the end of the Pax Americana. And I would see, you know, what we can look at how in in the last couple of years, the Wagner Group and jihadi groups have essentially destroyed stability and governance in a very significant section of Africa, one that has that has economic potential for great extended damage. We look at the war in Sudan, the sort of mounting crises in Ethiopia, where we'll see less and less willingness and resources from the international community to address these problems, even as the problems themselves grow worse. So Africa needs the Pax Americana, and Africa can contribute to the future of the Pax Americana. I think these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And as I was saying with respect to Uganda, part of this is the United States has to step back a bit and give, accept that we need to be working with the African governments that exist, rather than demanding sort of wholesale political reform. I mean, I remember reading a story at one point. They were having one of the, I'm sorry to say this, but not very persuasive elections in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I read stories about literally how helicopters were flying ballots out to isolated villages. And this was being told as a feel-good story about the spread of democracy. What it shows is a foreign policy world that is so out of touch with the realities on the ground. How many people in the DRC died because they couldn't be medevaced on helicopters to hospitals? What other terrible things, what could that money have done that was a lot better? Not that I'm against democracy, but what I'm saying is that the sort of views that come out of Western NGOs and foundations subject to fads. This year it's women's development, next year it's democracy promotion, next year it's literacy, next year it's malaria. It's just sort of these waves go and go and go. Nobody ever thinks back and says we've had 50 years of these waves of fads which have wasted resources and diverted efforts. All of us need to begin to think much more realistically and sensibly and seriously about what really can concretely be done. And the degree of, when I think of some of the ethnic problems that exist in Africa, and by the way, there are groups in Africa that if they were in Europe, we would call nations, but we call tribes. So let's talk about the issues of national groups and pan-national. Many African governments are more like the European Union than the government of France or Germany, where you have people with different civilizational backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, cultural traditions, sort of dealing with kind of weak and ineffective and deeply corrupt states. The imposition of the post-colonial development of Africa has not worked for Africans, and it is, I think, I don't think there's a simple path forward. I don't think that's how the world works. But in times like this, when the foundations of international order are under threat, when crises are rising on every hand, economies are likely to see greater crashes and burns, it's time for Africans to get very realistic and focused, and it's time for people outside of Africa who care to, again, think in a much deeper way about what's the best way forward.
On that note, my friends, we are out of time. I know there were other questions, and I apologize we didn't get to them, but won't you join me in thanking this great intellectual?